In the comments of the last video, after we'd finished recapping all the juicy Flashpoint stuff, I asked you guys what you wanted to see next, because we had a wide variety of topics. There doesn't seem to be much of a consensus, so I went with what I wanted to talk about next most of all, and that's more stuff to do with Balthazar, and that's more stuff to get us all on the same page about the guy. See, a lot of what we know about Balthazar is pretty old now. Many years ago, back at the original release of Guild Wars 1 Prophecies in 2006, they added as the very first endgame stuff to that game, the Guild Wars 1 equivalent of raiding, if you will, an area called the Fissure of Woe. The Fissure of Woe is a god realm, and it's Balthazar's god realm. It's elite endgame GW1 8-man content, and in it you get to explore what is essentially the equivalent of an open world Guild Wars 2 map, except if everybody dies in it, you get kicked out, it costs money to enter, and there's a variety of quests to complete. Finishing all of them at once gives you a bonus reward and a chest at the end. But because there's all these different quests, there is of course a lot of lore, and because this is Balthazar's realm, it's really some of the best lore we've ever had about the god. So I've already recapped a hell of a lot of stuff about Balthazar with you guys. There's a link in the description if you want to check it out, and please, if I've forgotten to put it there, someone help me out in the comments and mention it. But today, I want to really take a deep dive into the Fissure of Woe. Content that I've completed before. If you type Wooden Potatoes Fissure of Woe into YouTube, you will see me back in my Guild Wars 1 heyday, completing it with heroes in hard mode and doing generally impressive fun stuff. But it's been so many years now, I wanted to do a refresher, and I think that that's something you guys deserve to see as well. So today, we're going to sit back and we're going to talk about the Fissure of Woe lore. First, something else, more to do with Guild Wars 2 side, also referring to a video I've done before. You guys may remember a website called Tyria 3D. This is a website that would allow you to look into a Guild Wars 2.dat file and basically draw the maps that is there in that information and explore maps even if you're not technically in the Guild Wars 2 client. By feeding it old DATs with weird extra dev stuff in them, you could find some really interesting stuff. One of the most impressive and crazy wild things that Shaman and I ever managed to find using Tyria 3D was in Guild Wars 2 a version of the Fissure of Woe. Now, so I will link to that video as well. If you guys want to check it out, I sincerely recommend it. It looks like at some point since the release of Guild Wars 2 in the early days, around when Season 1 was being concepted, if anything, someone at ArenaNet did rebuild the Fissure of Woe Elite Endgame area in the Guild Wars 2 environment. And it had some really major differences, like the inclusion of a giant dead dragon, a lot of Orion architecture, and of course the return of a very iconic place that we saw in the Fissure of Woe in GW1 I'll be talking about very soon. It's really crazy, really interesting. The funny thing about when I created that video all that time ago now was Tyria 3D, as I was making the video, couldn't originally extract and look at textures, but in the middle of the creation of the video, it suddenly was allowed to. So I had all these theories about the map and the dead dragon and the idea that it might be some kind of alternate version of a Ra story mode or an instant that's supposed to take place after a Ra story mode because of the dead dragon. And then after we got the textures, it was very clear this was actually the Fissure of Woe instead. So really wild. After that video was made, and a little bit later in an AMA, the devs were asked about what we'd found, and at this point, they expressed that this map was kind of a side project, an extra thing that I think someone who just started working at the company was doing. Maybe it was an intern or something, someone who might not even be there anymore. So obviously the big question on your mind, on my mind as we go through this video is, are we going to see this stuff in Guild Wars 2? And they have flirted with it before in Guild Wars 2, but does the existence of that map and that video I did absolutely guarantee the Fissure of Woe will appear in, you know, some upcoming Living World episode or even the next expansion? Well, I'm not so sure about that. It's all pretty interesting though, and I would recommend people check it out. I mean, if you guys look back and dial back to when Heart of Thorns was coming out, we all knew the Balthazar temple was going to be there. We all knew raids were coming at the same time, and one of the top theories back as HOT was rolling in was that maybe we'd find a Fissure of Woe endgame version for Guild Wars 2, and that never happened, so maybe next expansion? That's what we're going to be asking ourselves as we play here. So one final extra thing as well, before we really get into Guild Wars 1 and dive into the lore that we got here, I want to talk about Menzies. So, at his core, Balthazar is a character who is the god of war, and he is in an eternal conflict, eternal struggle with his half brother. Is his half-brother on his mother's side or his father's side? We don't know, but there is word that Balthazar arrived onto the scene carrying the head of his father, and so the suggestion there might be that this is Menzies is his half-brother on his father's side, and the two of them don't like each other anymore because Balthazar chopped his dad's head off. But so these these half-brothers are eternally at war. Menzies versus Balthazar. And in the Fissure of Woe, we're going to see an awful lot of that. We're going to get extra details on what exactly was going on. In fact, all the details of what was going on there are basically going to be contained in this video. But Menzies himself, okay, Menzies the Deceiver, Menzies the leader of the Shadow Army, Balthazar the god of fire, and Menzies being his shadow, which I find a very interesting juxtaposition there. We have Menzies in the picture, and there's something funny going on in the game, in the community right now with regard to how we say Menzies. So I'm going to get this out of the way here, early in the video, because I want you guys to take this on board, and I want to be very clear about what's happening. So, Menzies. M-E-N-Z-I-E-S. Menzies. Some eagle-eyed people, way back in the day, noticed that Menzies is actually a term we find among the Scottish Highland clans or something. And of those clans who use the word or the term Menzies, I'm not even sure what it's supposed to refer to. In the real world, the pronunciation from those Scottish people was actually closer to Mingus. Yes, no joke, Mingus, which sounds kind of weird. And so that's some pretty interesting trivia about Menzies, right? Somebody therefore edited it onto the Guild Wars 1 wiki. A player put that pronunciation onto the wiki. And because Menzies is very much a Guild Wars 1 thing, and backup prophecies, especially where there wasn't much voice acting, though we've seen his name typed out a great many times, we have never heard Menzies said out loud. This is something that could finally happen in the current Guild Wars 2 storylines, which I'm sure we're all very excited about. But now there's a bit of a question, because we're talking about Menzies a lot now. How do you pronounce his name? Is it Menzies, as you'd expect, and in my opinion sounds cooler, or is it Mingus, in reference to these old Scottish Highland clans? Now, we discussed this quite recently, and I've heard apparently Scottish people saying that only in the most crazy rural areas, theoretically, do people in the modern day even use Mingus within Scotland, and even there, no one's ever really heard it be called Mingus instead of Menzies. But there is a possibility. So, the really unfortunate thing that happened the other day is somebody tweeted ArenaNet this, or they tweeted Guild Wars 2, hey, how do you pronounce it? Because we're kind of curious. And they got a response. They got a response on Twitter from RB2. RB2 is Ruby Bayer. She is not a dev. She is not an architect of the law. She can obviously speak with the devs, and she can obviously get information from them. But Ruby's answer was this. It was to look at the Guild Wars 1 wiki, look at the trivia section, and declare therefore from the trivia section that this is how you say his name, which is Mingus. And so now people are taking it as more of a cold hard fact that it is Mingus. But let me just say, guys, because Ruby pointed at a trivia section that was edited on by a player as kind of a piece of interest rather than anything else, and now Ruby said it, doesn't necessarily hold 100% up to me. And honestly, I'm kind of mad at this because I'm not sure what to call the god now. I prefer Menzies, but if we all absolutely dogmatically state it is Mingus from now on, and you hear me saying that in the videos, then, well, I'm doing this to placate those who will complain about my pronunciation going forward. Mingus or Menzies, I don't know. It's up to you guys to decide. Is Ruby's tweet here anything concrete? Will we just have to wait until we hear it in some voice acting, perhaps in the next episode or a little bit later? Let me know. But yes, for the purposes of today's video, I'm going to remain firmly in the realm of Menzies, who we all know what I'm talking about. Right, okay, so let's get into the Fissure of Woe. Let's talk a little bit about it as a function of Endgame. So I want to take this opportunity to teach some Guild Wars 2 players how elitist and exclusionary and difficult and punishing Guild Wars 1 was back in its heyday. You know, a lot of times people take this kind of derisive stance towards Guild Wars 2 and say that, you know, it moved too much towards World of Warcraft and it took all these traditional mechanics and it made grind too much of a thing, and, you know, it never respected players' time as much as GW1 did, because GW1 only had 20 levels and so forth. Well, let's take a look at what Guild Wars 1 was like at its original release, when Fissure of Woe was very first added, because I think it would be very surprising to hear you guys the kind of extreme mechanics ArenaNet once upon a time did, and at a time when, you know, this franchise was supposedly at its most, you know, welcoming, okay? So when the Fissure of Woe was first added, and this will blow your mind, it was locked off by two things. First of all, you had to pay to get into there, and that's still true to this day. But the price was actually reasonably high, too, especially when you consider the launch economies and how things functioned back then. So you wanted to get into the Fissure of Woe and its brother area, the Underworld. You wanted to get into these places so that you could farm awesome materials and stuff. But if you went in with a bad team and you wiped, you got kicked out and lost your money. So imagine having to pay to enter Guild Wars 2's raids or dungeons or fractals. Pretty wild, right? Further, beyond this, and this is the really crazy thing, it was locked off by a mechanic called Favor of the Gods. So Favor of the Gods no longer isn't really a thing. You can enter at any time. Favor of the Gods as well is triggered by players getting achievements in Guild Wars 1. But here's how it originally worked, and a lot of you guys might not know this. To enter the Fissure of Woe, your realm needed Favor of the Gods, in which case a statue to Balthazar would have magic all around it. It would appear fiery and it would have all these flash animations. And you could kneel in front of the statue to Balthazar. Balthazar's eternal champion would come out to you. And because you had Favor of the Gods, he would approach you. And he would say, hey, do you want to join us in the Fissure of Woe and complete some quests and do some good stuff? If you want to be challenged by Balthazar, then join us, but you need to pay us to get in, all right? So that was how it worked. But your realm needed Favor of the Gods. The way you got Favor of the Gods was only one region, the Asian territories, the European territories, or the American territories, could have Favor of the Gods at once. Only one of them would have it. So if North America had access to the Fissure of Woe, it meant Europeans didn't, and the Chinese didn't. And beyond that, how did you decide which region had Favor of the Gods? Well, that's what was happening in PvP. It was the top PvP teams in a different format entirely, the Heroes Ascent game mode, or Tomb of the Primeval Kings, that were competing in the Hall of Heroes, and only those who were winning Favor of the Gods for their region. How crazy is that? Can you imagine that in Guild Wars 2 terms? Forcing people to have competitive PvP abilities to win the ability to raid for entire regions at once? And so, naturally, over time, this stuff got culled away. But I think this is one of the most fascinating things to look back at and really see the roots of this franchise and watch all the many, many places that things have shifted and twisted. This is far more unapproachable than anything Guild Wars 2 raiding ever did. And yet we have this weird phobia around it in our community these days without actually looking at what GW1 was way back when in its heyday. Not for particularly long, but hey, that is something very cool about Fissure of Woe that I wanted to talk to you guys about. So another thing about Fissure of Woe, drawing some more interesting comparisons and ideas about Guild Wars 2, is how would this potentially be implemented in GW2? Because none of this Favor of the Gods stuff is obviously going to be a thing, right? But how do we actually get Fissure of Woe? Some people have been speculating it could be a raid because it's a super hard endgame content for super hard endgame content, and I think that that's a reasonable thing to say. But when you really break it down, the Fissure of Woe in Guild Wars 1 is very different to a Guild Wars 2 raid. Guild Wars 2 raids are great, and I like the way that they did the story, and I think that the Fissure of Woe couldn't ask for a better team to take control of it if it were to come into Guild Wars 2 because Balthazar is now in the story. But on the other hand, the Fissure of Woe in GW1 is much more like an open world map. So at first it may seem kind of ugly to think about. It might be better if we are going to the Fissure of Woe in GW2 because of Balthazar's reintroduction, that it be an open world map instead. That it be a bigger, more persistent area of the game. A little bit like what we see at Halloween when we go to the Mad King's realm, for example. And within that open world map, you could then have a raid that branches off of it and deliver your elite endgame stuff there too. But that, I think, is actually a much more realistic way that we will see, if we ever do, the Fissure of Woe in GW2 as an open world map with dynamic events there, very similar to the Mad King's realm. And yes, you may have this itch for some super difficult stuff, but that's where a raid would come off of it. Or hell, even, and this is the other thing people have suggested, a dungeon might come off of it. So some people have thought, hey, what if dungeons were to be supported again in the game? I've made my opinions on this quite clear, but one place where dungeons do match very nicely with the Fissure of Woe format is dungeons in Guild Wars 2 kind of are these broad, explorable maps And where in Guild Wars 1 you had 12 different quests you could choose from, in Dungeons we have like the 3 different paths that we vote on, right? And you could do a Fissure of Woe style thing that was in the name of a dungeon, really, and you got to vote on which paths particularly you did, or what order you did the paths from a GW2 perspective. So in many ways, Fissure of Woe can work in Guild Wars 2, but it would have to shift and it would have to change. I think my favorite idea is as an open world map. The more I think about it, as an open world map, it leaves us more opportunity to spend a lot of time there, really get to grips with it, make it feel bigger than it was in Guild Wars 1, dive into the lore more than we had opportunity to in Guild Wars 1. Like, raids are great, but they're also, you know, quite finite in the amount of stuff they can deliver. When you look at the way that Living World Season 3 maps have been dropped in, you get so much replayability out of them. I kind of like the idea of the Fissure of Woe as that, so we really get to grips with it in Guild Wars 2. So yeah, there you go. That's how we might see it in Guild Wars 2. That's the stuff about the data mining. Let's jump in and talk about what we learned in it from Guild Wars 1. A bit of a tour I went through on a stream, played it with you guys, and, well, this is what we had. So the main thing that you were going for in the Fissure of Woe as a player, really, was there's a giant temple in the center, the Temple of War, and at the center of the Temple of War, you could craft the Guild Wars 1 equivalent of legendary armor. This was known as Obsidian armor at the time. It cost a huge amount of money. It cost your regular materials, but then it also cost 2 other materials. It cost something called Obsidian shards, which dropped only, really, in the Fissure of Woe, and it cost ectoplasm, which dropped mostly from the other endgame area that had been added at the same time, the Underworld. And so this was the idea. You were supposed to play tons of Fissure of Woe, tons of Underworld, to gather all this stuff to eventually get this armor. And this armor wasn't particularly flashy looking, Obsidian armor, but it was a mark of prestige. And that was really the main thing through all of Guild Wars 1, even after Cantha came out, even after Alona came out, even after Eye of the North, Obsidian armor sat as the champion among the top of all of them. And because it cost so many ectos, and because it cost so many Obsidian shards, these were currencies that had a lot of value. Even to this day, people still trade in ectoplasm in GW1 because of that value that it had born from Obsidian armor. And so that's why now you might think, aha! When the Straits of Devastation was added to Guild Wars 2 and we got to cleanse the Balthazar temple, where was the one place you could get Obsidian shards in Guild Wars 2? It was from the Temple of Balthazar, and that was a reference to the fact that Obsidian shards mostly came from the Fissure of Woe in GW1. They are a Balthazar-associated material. And if Balthazar's becoming a thing in Guild Wars 2, I wouldn't be surprised to see more Obsidian-related stuff. It's funny to me that the legendary armor was added at the same patch as Balthazar's reveal in the story, but they didn't decide to make the legendary armor Obsidian armor in Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2 legendary armor could have been Obsidian armor. You know, all those kind of twitching crystals? If they just made them black and said it was Obsidian instead, then boom, that would have been a beautiful parallel. Obsidian armor coming to the sequel. Maybe one day we will see that, but as you guys should be well aware, I covered this already in the Ask Me Anything. The developers did say they have no plans to make more legendary armor in Guild Wars 2 as of right now. So if we ever do go to the Fissure of Woe in the sequel, I know many people will be looking for Obsidian armor, but it might not be legendary. I think that would be a huge mistake, but it is what it is. I'm curious what you guys think about that. So, as you've probably gathered from the footage, the environment of the Fissure of Woe is very fiery, it's very molten, it's incredibly reminiscent actually and borrows from a lot of Fire Island chain stuff. So you know those skulls that are baked into the walls and the lava plumes and all of that? That's really Fire Island chain assets which they repurposed and use in the Fissure of Woe. So again, it's really cool that the Flashpoint patch gave us Balthazar back and took us to the Fire Island chain when the Fissure of Woe is so reminiscent of the Fire Island chain. It's a place of eternal war. It's broken down into multiple different regions. And as I described the various quests we got to complete in the Fissure of Woe and talk to you guys about the lore here, we'll talk about the various different environs of the Fissure of Woe we travel to at the same time. But when we are first dropped in, we are fighting in service of Balthazar, and this realm is described to host monsters more dangerous than anything that we've ever seen in the mortal realm. Whether that's true or hyperbole is up to you guys. I like the idea that there's horrible, you know, really badass, messed up demons out in the mist, and it's more dangerous than Tyria, and if they carry that through in Guild Wars 2, then that's going to be brilliant. So, when we land in the Fissure of Woe, instantly our party of 8 players are surrounded by the Shadow Army. The Shadow Army is very simple. These guys are minions of Menzies. And so we don't really see very much influence from them in Guild Wars 2. In Guild Wars 2, the Underworld, the equivalent to the Fissure of Woe, actually has some interesting lore, like around God's Lost Swamp, and there's suggestions about the Shadow Behemoth and the Akche that come out and all of that interesting stuff. Shadow Army really don't have much of a place in Guild Wars 2 right now, but this is the army of Menzies. This is Balthazar's army fights the Shadow Army, okay? And so they surround us. They have a lot of different varieties. Most of them are called like Shadow Monk or Shadow Mesmer, Shadow Elementalist, Shadow Warrior. I think that's kind of interesting. They're essentially named after the original roster of Guild Wars 1 classes. And we saw in Guild Wars 2 that when the devs saw this before, they did something fairly interesting. So if you look at the Ascalon Catacombs dungeon, when you look at the ghosts that are within the Ascalon Catacombs dungeon, they're all also named after Guild Wars 1 class designations. So if we ever see the Fissure of Woe in GW2, I wouldn't be surprised if the Shadow Army is there. And the Shadow Army, again, are references purely back to that original roster of the first 6 classes for this franchise. You know, we have very different ones by the time we got Guild Wars 2, and we've got 9 of them now. But back then it was just 6, and I would really like to see them do that and do some, you know, references back to those old skills. Just like when Bloodstone Fen came out in Guild Wars 2, we saw that the White Mantle were using a lot of GW1 abilities. If you had your combat log open as you got attacked by them, you'd see Guild Wars 1 skill names. I'd love to see this happen with the Shadow Army as well. So they're not particularly interesting looking characters, they're just black and shady and whatever. We do see other members of the Shadow Army in Guild Wars 1 during the Nightfall storyline, where they were working in allegiance with Abaddon as he was trying to break free, and we even see a little bit of their influence in the Domain of Anguish as well, which was the Nightfall endgame stuff, where you have Ravenheart Gloom, one of my all-time favorite places in all of Guild Wars, but isn't too relevant to the Fissure of Woe. Among the Shadow Army, there are Shadow Beasts, presumably a part of the army, and these very cool creatures, okay, called Abyssals. Oh my god, doesn't Abyssal sound cool? I really want to see Abyssals come back in Guild Wars 2, and I want to see them get the Oakheart treatment, right? Like, Oakhearts look kind of crappy and weird in Guild Wars 1, and then they made them look super big and badass in GW2. Oh my god, can you imagine going back to the Fissure of Woe in Guild Wars 2 and seeing these Abyssals, except they're like these huge messed up monsters made of shadow and twitching, like the bad guy in Moana, for example. Oh, that would be so cool. But yeah, so you've got Abyssals, and these are generally the main things that we're going to be fighting. When you first load in, if you open your quest log, you'll just see you have 12 different objectives, and all of them are question mark, 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 question mark. You don't know what there is to do here. Also a kind of interesting mechanic, and something I wonder whether they'll bring back when or if this returns in the second game. When we enter, we kill some Shadow Army, and we meet a character called an Eternal. This is the first quest. It's a man named Rastagan the Eternal. So the Eternal are... So Menzies has his Shadow Army. Balthazar has his Eternals army. The Eternals are very bright, ghostly, pure-looking entities that are, you know, eternally at war with the Shadow armies, right? And so this is an Eternal, great heroes of Balthazar's. Rastagan is one of them. He explains that Balthazar brought us to his realm, not because he needed our help in his war against Menzies, but because he brought us there as a test. So I did see an interesting theory on one of my recent videos. Someone said, hey, yeah, it always seemed to me that Balthazar was losing the war, otherwise why did he bring us in? No. We immediately get explained when we enter the Fissure of Woe. We're only there because Balthazar wants to test us. Balthazar's quite cavalier, and he's like, yeah, we'll see how these guys do. So we want to help out as many Eternals as possible and, you know, earn the favor of Balthazar, as it were. So, Rastagan explains that there's a big tower nearby. It's called the Tower of Courage. You guys should recall that among war and fire and other themes, courage is another big theme of Balthazar's. So there's a Tower of Courage, and it has fallen under the sway of Menzies' Shadow Army, and we must recapture it by defeating the creature on the inside. This is where we hear as well that Menzies is not just some random demigod or whatever, but it's actually Balthazar's half-brother. Curiously, Menzies is never referred to as a demigod. Menzies' actual power is never expressly laid on a platter to us. Menzies could just be a ghost. He could just be a spirit in the afterlife like any other. He doesn't necessarily, back in Guild Wars 1 days, have any particular godliness to him. He was just a half-brother of Balthazar's. Now, we kind of believe and think that he might have had something divine to him, but that's not necessarily true. And maybe think about that when constructing some of your theories, guys. But Menzies has this title, the Lord of Destruction. If our theories in Guild Wars 2 of today day are that Balthazar has been cast down as a god and Menzies has stepped up now. Is Balthazar now a god of destruction or something? Kind of interesting. Will we ever get meaning from lines like that Menzies is the lord of destruction? Or is it just worthless flavor, like calling something the door of Kamali, even though Kamali doesn't mean anything? I guess that remains to be seen, how deep the devs go with this now that Balthazar is back in the story. So, we want to capture the Tower of Courage. We enter it. Inside, we find a Shadow Lord. So there are a couple of Shadow Lords. These seem to be high-ranking minions in the Shadow Army. This is Shadow Lord Vorgis. We defeat Shadow Lord Vorgis and we capture the tower. And really, all of the Fissure of Woe quests, one kind of feels like it's supposed to be the last one. You can do it in any order, but one of them feels like it's supposed to be the last one, and that's capturing another tower. And we'll talk about that right at the end of this video, where there's another Shadow Lord. But so we kill Shadow Lord Vorgis. Who is Vorgis? What is Vorgis? Why is Vorgis? None of those things are ever answered. Will Vorgis be referenced any time in Guild Wars 2? Perhaps. There's literally no lore there, really. But Balthazar is happy that we've done this, and the quest test kind of says the realm is now open to you. And you kind of just get to go and explore. Rastagan is with us at this point, though, and if you speak to him again, he has another quest for you. He describes a forest nearby. And when I say a forest, I mean a real forest, right? This is a realm of fire and brimstone, and it's very, you know, desolate, and it's an afterlife. But this is a very real forest, a lush, verdant-looking forest. It's even got like a little town in it. Well, a little village, I suppose, a few buildings. There's a forest nearby, and it's untouched. It's untouched because neither Balthazar nor Menzies have ever had dominion over it, all right? And there is a powerful lord there, a wailing lord, who sees over the forest, and neither Balthazar nor Menzies seem to want to anger this wailing lord. They just sort of let him stay there. But Balthazar had been sending his Eternals into the forest to gather lumber and things for the war effort. Kind of reminds me a lot of World vs. World for some reason. Gathering them there, but while he was there, the Banshees, associates of this Wailing Lord, have been killing Balthazar's minions. And so Rastagan is upset about this, and he says, look, go to the forest, kill these Banshees that have been assaulting Balthazar's workers, but do not touch the Wailing Lord. And once you have done this, we will be happy. So that's really the next place that I think is best to go to. We head to the forest. It's an interesting quest where there's an enemy on screen who you actually can't kill. If you do kill him, if you friendly fire him, the Wailing Lord, then you get kicked out of the Fissure of Woe. But you kill all of these Banshees. The forest itself is filled with these characters called Spirit Shepherds and Spirit Woods. Now, the Shepherds are essentially Oak Hearts from Guild Wars 1, who, as we all know, kind of seem to have these connections to Melanju a lot of the time. So is there some weird connection with Melanju's realm going on here? Is there something deeper? This whole Balthazar versus Melanju stuff? Don't forget, we've got a lot to talk about with Melanju in this patch because of the Druids in Flashpoint. Are the devs going to do a connection here? Or does it not necessarily mean anything? It's kind of up to you guys to decide. Here also we see lots of worms. There are a great many worms in the Fissure of Woe. Giant flaming siege worms in some areas and lots of little ones here. And we find, yeah, a little town, a little place. And again, if we got to go back here in Guild Wars 2, it would be nice if this was a regular open world map and we got to go and experience the people who live there, find out who built it, why it's there, and so forth. Because in GW1, we just don't really get any of that. So, upon defeating the Banshees, we can speak to the Wailing Lord, who gives us a quest. And he says, basically, I bow before you and Balthazar. Please let me offer Balthazar a gift. And what he says is that there are 3 griffins in the forest, and he wants to give those to Balthazar to serve as Balthazar's hounds. So, we know that Balthazar has 2 hounds, Tamar and Tagon, and they are literally hounds. They're like mastiffs. They're not griffins, but here in this quest, we hear that, you know, he's given 3 griffins to serve as hounds for him, that the Wailing Lord wants Balthazar to have. Whether we'll see or hear of those in GW2, I don't know. Obviously, not every little facet and detail that we talk about here today has to be referenced in the sequel, but it's kind of curious to think about. So, we grab these griffins, and we're supposed to escort them back to the Tower of Courage and back to Rastagan, where we can collect our quest rewards. And that's probably one of the most brutal quests in the Fissure of Woe. You can accidentally get kicked out. If you watch my full playthrough of it from years ago when I was doing this in hard mode, I actually died here and got kicked out and had to spend several hours going back through. So back to the Tower of Courage. That's already 3 of the 12 quests done, and the first branch of the Fissure of Woe really kind of completed. So we explore deeper inside, and we go to the large central area, which is a large battlefield. A large battlefield where the Eternals have been fighting against the Shadow Army. This really, if I think Fissure of Woe, it's this area here. And here we meet some Eternals in a tent who are staging warring operations and so forth. There are 3 characters. There's an Eternal Weaponsmith. There's a guy called Cromriel the Eternal and Zutai the Eternal. Zutai doesn't say anything to us and has no real lore. Cromriel, though, does have a quest. Cromriel suggests that Menzies, who is described as a deceiver, that Menzies has his own lords in a tent across from them on the other side of the battlefield, and that Menzies has acquired some unholy texts with dark sorcery that must be prevented. So you get a quest to go to Menzies' camp here and slay the members of the Shadow Army that are over there, grab the unholy texts, bring them back to this camp, and, you know, destroy them. Are those unholy texts references to anything else in the lore? Well, really, we can't pick or anything. The in-game model is, funnily enough, something I think you can get as a back piece in Guild Wars 2, but whether we really will find out the contents of those texts, I don't know. It's maybe not that important. But they suggest that now that Balthazar's forces have these unholy texts, that they can use them to crush the Shadow Army. But it's an eternal war, so it's kind of funny, right? And there's this question constantly in Guild Wars 1. We go to the Fissure of Woe, and we help Balthazar out immensely. By the time we leave the Fissure of Woe, by the time this video is done, we've done a huge amount to help Balthazar out. And yet now, 250 years later, Balthazar appears to be some kind of a fallen god, guys. So what happened? We seem to help him out a lot, but it really feels like he fell to Menzies, or something terrible happened here, even though we left him with the upper hand in the first game, giving him these unholy texts and many more other things, recapturing towers for him and so forth. So one interesting thing that I will try not to bog the video down too much with at this point in this quest is you will actually see some enemies on this battlefield. There's lots of reanimated skeletons and undead that we fight, but there are dragons here. Bone dragons. Bone dragons that we had seen Vizier Kilbraun had resurrected, presumably some of the fauna of Ore from way back when. But there are bone dragons here, and they're called dragon liches. So whether these will be a thing in Guild Wars 2, I have no idea. And if they are they going to look like Tequatl the Sunless or Ogravos the Moon Death or any of those other epic dragons we fought in a Ra story mode? I've got no idea. And the idea that they're dragon liches as well, and there's so much undeady kind of stuff going on here. The idea of dragons in the mist is just a crazy can of worms. If you guys are titillated by the thought of this, please do feel free to drop some theories down below. But yeah, there are some dragon liches here, and maybe the devs, if they ever do a Guild Wars 2 Fissure of Woe, might look at that and try and draw on it. There's just so many places that we could take the discussion there. I'll leave it at the door. Lastly, we have the Weaponsmith that I mentioned a second ago. Now, the Weaponsmith has a quest that leads to the very center of the Fissure of Woe and to the Great Forge Master and the Temple of War. And these are the things I was referring to earlier, where you could craft Guild Wars 1's version of legendary armor, guys. Obsidian armor. And so if we wanted that armor, we have to do this quest, right? From the Weaponsmith. The Weaponsmith explains, yeah, please go recapture the Temple of War for us. It's fallen to the forces of Menzies. This was, and I cannot express this enough to you guys, this was the big thing about the Fissure of Woe. More people back in the Guild Wars 1's heyday farmed the underworld and stuff. There was farming that happened in the Fissure of Woe. Really, the main thing about the Fissure of Woe was this big temple, the Temple of War, and crafting your obsidian armor, all right? So the idea of getting that and really doing justice to that in Guild Wars 2 is something very exciting to me. One of the most disgusting things we could see ArenaNet do is similar to how they added the Chaos Gloves to the Gem Store. If they added obsidian armor to the Guild Wars 2 Gem Store to coincide with some kind of Fissure of Woe release, I think it would make a lot of Guild Wars 1 players vomit. This was a big deal back then, and so really try and remember that. So we do this quest, we head to the Temple of War, we destroy the forces in front, we break our way in, and we clear out all of the Shadow Army on the inside and speak with the Eternal Forgesmith at the center. Now, this Eternal Forgesmith, from his name and the way he looks as a ghost, he seems to be another Eternal, all right? But unlike a human Eternal, he's actually a centaur, and that's very interesting to me. How comes the Forgesmith is a centaur? The centaurs have never been particularly renowned as great crafters, and yet here we have one. No real lore as to who he is or why he is, but there is a centaur at the center of the Fissure of Woe, the only one we find. mind. And he is the Eternal Forge Smith who creates this ultimate armor for us back in the first game. No sooner as we have captured the temple and we have got the attention of the Forge Smith, Menzies is mad that we have done this, and he sends his forces in to try and recapture the place from us, and we have to defeat multiple waves of enemies who are trying to get to the Forge to kill the Forge Smith. So there is something very striking to me about this moment in the Fissure of Woe when I think of Guild Wars 2, when I think of this franchise, and it should be really obvious to you guys as well at this point. What we experience here in the Fissure of Woe is exactly what we experience over and over again in Guild Wars 2. What we're experiencing here is a traditional questing version of what dynamic events are so good at. Think about this, guys, here. We got the Temple of War, right? This is exactly what it's like to play Guild Wars 2 in the open world. Say you're in Ore, right? You go to the Temple of Lissa. You kill the enemies that are at the Temple of Lissa and capture it for yourself. A little bit later, an opposing faction, in that case it was the minions of Zaitan, try to attack, and they try to take it back from you, and you defend it. And once you've defended it, stuff starts branching out of it. If you think about any of the outposts from Heart of Thorns, this is what dynamic events are amazing at doing. And here you're seeing, beat for beat, a Guild Wars 1 version of it being executed with traditional quests. So I cannot help but think that if Balthazar's back in the story, if the Fissure of Woe is a potential place we might go to soon in the sequel, that if they did this as an open world map, the devs would not be able to resist the temptation to redo this. To do the Temple of War again, to have it be captured by the Shadow Army, and have it in dynamic event form instead. Have it as a meta event. Have it as an outpost even. A system which we know that they developed for Heart of Thorns and presumably will be in there for future expansions to come. This is beat for beat an outpost. Even as well, even better than this, once you have captured and defended the location, there are more quests that start triggering out of it. Just like how in Guild Wars 2 now escort events might start spiraling out of your outpost or whatever. It's exactly the same here. Once we've defended it, we get several new quests. 2 of them come from the Eternal Forge Master, okay? So, and some of the biggest lore of the entire Fissure of Woe comes right here, right now. And this is the most interesting thing. This is my biggest takeaway of looking at it, and something that's really exciting to me. It is revealed at this point from the Eternal Forge Master that the Fissure of Woe, here at the center of the Fissure of Woe, at the Temple of War, this is where the very arms and armor of the gods are forged. This is where Balthazar gets his armor. This is where Balthazar gets his big badass greatsword we see in the Flashpoint patch. This is where all the gods got their arms and their defenses from. This is so cool. It reminds me of in Nightfall, when Varesh Osir is trying to finish her ritual to bring about Nightfall. You can see pieces of Abaddon's armor flying around like his gauntlets and stuff. To think that stuff was all forged here. This is where that stuff is created. And so I think that this could be a really powerful thing for the devs to look at and maybe reintroduce the Fissure of Woe in Guild Wars 2, right? If the gods are coming back to the story, if we're looking at a version of Guild Wars 2 where Balthazar's running around with us and Lissa and Dwayna and Melandra or anyone is running around with us, if they're doing some story about bringing Balthazar back to his full strength, Balthazar would probably want control of this temple, right? To gear himself up. And maybe we're fighting against him, or maybe we're assisting him eventually in that ambition. This is something that's really cool to me, and I think that the devs could totally play into. This is where the arms and armor of the gods are forged, guys. How cool is that? And as well, like, that makes it even more special, the idea of wearing Obsidian armor back in DW1. So, we basically hear that this is where everything's forged, but the fires of the forge have been put out by Menzies' army. There are some plants, some seeds of corruption in a nearby tunnel, and we need to go cleanse that tunnel to relight the fire. So that's one of the quests we do. We head into these little tunnels. There's not too much to say there. There's, and this is essentially what you can imagine an escort event in Guild Wars 2 might be, with the old outpost concept. The other quest that the Forge Master gives us is that he explains that Menzies took this temple not through force of arms, not through taking, you know, war at its face value, not through fighting Balthazar's people on even ground, but Menzies was deceptive. Menzies won the temple through treachery, not force of arms. And it was through this that Menzies waylaid the protectors of the temple and took it for himself. So this is really cool to pull out as well. In Guild Wars 1 days, you had Balthazar, who seems to be very honorable, right? And he's all about open combat, and he's all about level footing and so on. But Menzies, his half-brother, is being sneaky, and he's being deceitful. And we see this again and again and again in the Fissure of Woe. And that's how eventually Menzies started winning. This is really interesting, right? Because when you look at Guild Wars 2 in Flashpoint, what is Balthazar saying? Balthazar has gone back on his Guild Wars 1 beliefs. Balthazar saying I no longer see the glory in battle or the honor in war. And it's funny because it's like, whatever happened to Balthazar, he's kind of now acting like Menzies. Now Balthazar seems to be the deceitful one. What did Balthazar do through Living World Season 3? He deceived us by posing as Lazarus. Balthazar has become everything he presumably hated about his brother. And I love what they did there narratively. I wonder if they're going to take that further. And then there's this other idea that if Menzies was the deceitful one in GW1, if Menzies is now maybe risen to power, can we assume that? If Balthazar is now something of a fallen god, who took that strength? Did Menzies take it? And if that is true, and Menzies is now the one in a position of strength, does that mean that Menzies now sees honor in war and so forth, and Menzies isn't deceitful? It's kind of one of those really sad things where Balthazar may have become everything he hated and what he saw in his half-brother. Really, really cool, and I hope that the devs embellish on that. But so yeah, we heard again it was through deceit that Menzies won this place, and we're essentially asked to go and deal with the leader of the Protectors of the Temple, who was a turncoat, and he ran off. He saw us coming and he ran off, so we want to go deal with him. The man named Lord Kobe, a schemer as he's described, and he's fled, and we want to go chase him into the Lake of Fire. So the Lake of Fire is another region of the Fissure of Woe. Not too much to say about it, except that it featured apparently very prominently in this Datamine map we saw a few years ago. And also, in addition to those two quests, there's another one. There's another Eternal here, not the Forge Master, but another character called Lord Teres. Lord Teres, an Eternal of Balthazar, is here, who also has a quest. Now, you might think, Lord Teres, why do I recognize that name? As a Guild Wars 2 player, you may well. And that's because when they did the Champion Bag update, one of the named new exotic weapons that could come out of bandit chests, the bandit champion bags, is a weapon called Lord Teres's Shadow. So there is a reference to this random Eternal for some reason in Guild Wars 2. What the devs are hinting at, I've got no idea. Are they hinting at anything, saying that it's Lord Teres's Shadow? Well, Lord Teres is an Eternal, a member of Balthazar's army, and his weapon is being described as a shadow, which is more of a Menzies thing. I mean, what is that suggestive of? Some people have said, does that mean that Menzies might be winning? I don't know whether we can really draw that. It's just a bit odd, right? And I don't know whether we'll get anything deeper, or the devs just thought it would be a cool name for a weapon in Guild Wars 2. But yeah, for some reason, he does have a named exotic after him. And it's very similar to, yes, there was a very recent gem store update where Menzies was referenced. A gem store weapon, Menzies Anguish, or Menzies Agony, I think it's called, was just added to the gem store. And again, it's like, how much do we draw from these weapon names? I'm not sure I've got too much more to say on that, guys. I know a lot of you were expecting a great deal of speculation, but that's really all I've got. So this third quest that Lord Teres gives us is, he says he wants us to seal our victory against Menzies by storming another tower. So you remember how we opened in the Fissure of Woe by taking out the Tower of Courage? There's another tower, the Tower of Strength. And within this tower is another Shadow Lord, described as the Shadow Lord. I wonder if this was supposed to be, you know, like a final boss style thing. It just didn't work out that way in the end. He doesn't have an explicit name, unlike the first Shadow Lord we fought in the other tower. But he's going to send some Eternal Sigil Mages with us to break into the tower. We kill the Lord, and, you know, that's kind of Menzies' forces absolutely crippled by the time we finish this quest. Kind of interesting that they call them Eternal Sigil Mages. Clearly, guys, when this comes to Guild Wars 2, which it absolutely will, we'll have Eternal Sigils added to the game at that time as well, which are going to be Ascended Sigils that never break, just like when we're slotting runes in Legendary Armor. Called it here first. Okay, no. So, but Eternal Sigil Mages, pretty cool name, and yeah, that's one of the other big quests where we take out this Lord. A pretty easy one, to be honest. There are some other little side things to do as well while we're participating in these last couple of quests. Just outside of the Temple of War is probably one of my favorite things about the Fissure of Woe. There's a character there who is not a member of the Shadow Army, is not associated with the Wailing Lord in the forest, is not a member of the Eternals, is not a mysterious centaur, but is none other than a human. A mortal. Just a guy in the Fissure of Woe, in the realms of the gods, hanging out, hunting stuff. He's a ranger. His name is Nimros the hunter. So Nimros may be a term you recognize, a designation of crate, but I don't think that really counts for anything. I think it's just a coincidence. But this guy, Nimros, he's a hunter. And we speak to him and he says, hey, yeah, I'm immortal. No wonder you're doing well. You have favor of the gods. I got here unaided. I just traveled here off of my own will. I didn't have to rely on the gods to get to the Fissure of Woe. I did it on my own. Very, you know, Ark style, mist travel and exploration, Lord Odrin style exploration here from this hunter. And what he is doing is he's arrived without the aid of the gods, just in search of great prey. This guy's like an original Norn. Before the Norn even existed in this lore, he's, you know, he's hunting for prey. Really cool. He's looking for these creatures called shard wolves. Maybe the idea is that they're made of obsidian shards or something, I don't know. But he's on his first day here, he's killed 7, and he challenges us in a friendly competition. Can you also beat 7? And so this quest is to travel around the Fissure of Woe, finding these wolves and killing them. But this is really cool. There's a mortal here. And amazingly, when we finish that quest, there's a bit of dialogue at the end where he says, perhaps we'll meet again and we'll challenge one another again. And then he leaves, and we leave the Fissure of Woe. And of course, Guild Wars 1 never had any updates to Fissure of Woe content like that. We never did go back to the Fissure of Woe. Eventually, they did Eye of the North, and then they went to Guild Wars 2, and we never did meet again. But what about in Guild Wars 2, guys? Could we meet again? I mean, the Mist Realms, these places that the gods inhabit, these are afterlives. These places don't necessarily, as a part of the Mist and a function of the Mist, exist in the same, you know, timeline as us. 250 years may have passed on Tyria, but who's to say that this guy might not have just eternally have long life here, or there's any kind of weird magic Mist mumbo-jumbo excuse as to why we might find this guy again, and he may not have aged. You know, like when we meet Ark in the Mist, he says, who or when or where or when are you from, right? Like, you just don't know with the Mist. So I love the idea, if we come back here in Guild Wars 2, because Balthazar's now part of the story, what if we meet Nimros the Hunter again? That would be so awesome and a great little callback. So, as we do all of these different quests, we go to a couple of other regions that are worth talking about. There's an area of the Fissure of Woe called the Fissure Shore, which you guys can see here. One of my favorite areas of the Fissure of Woe, you know, just an eternal, unending horizon out there. Beautiful waterfalls, large bones strewn about on the beaches, wrecked ships. There's actually an NPC here called Admiral Saidan the Eternal. And he stood on the beach, but he has no quests or anything. Maybe this was cut content at some point or something I don't understand. But he's just kind of stood there and he talks to you and he doesn't really say anything of any worth. But yes, there is an admiral with his wrecked fleet of ships here on the Fissure Shore. The enemies we fight here are Driders, who are creatures that we tend to find in high magic areas or close to the mists and on Tyria side. There's another area called the Burning Forest. So don't mistake this with where the Wailing Lord was. This forest is totally on fire and burnt down and a wreck. Very Fissure of Woe, flaming molten trees everywhere. Here we find Hydra. Again, remember that we saw Hydra in the Crystal Desert in GW1, various areas of Ascalon, the Fire Island chain, and here. Oh, please, Arena, add the Hydra at some point. I'm so excited to see the Hydra in Guild Wars 2 someday. And then the last area really is in this forest, or the last quest is a side quest with a character called Miko the Unchained, who explains that Menzies has been using slaves to harvest this burning forest, which they use in quotes, so maybe it's not even a real forest, but they've been using it to harvest materials for shadow smiths who make the Shadow Army's gear, right? And so we're going to kill the enemies, free the slaves, and Menzies won't be able to arm his people anymore. When we free the slaves, something very interesting as well, the slaves are like, yes, thank you for freeing us, but they express a lot of upset that Grenth, who is the judger in the afterlife and decides what afterlife you go to, these guys are like, man, I can't believe Grenth sent us to the Fissure of Woe. I'm mad at him. I'm going to go back and seek a new judgment from him, which is kind of crazy to think about and very interesting. So we save those slaves. And really, that's most of the Fissure of Woe there, guys. Believe me, after what I have said in this video, you are now up to date with a good 75 to 90%, especially in combination with the other video I did on Balthazar earlier in the week, of all of the Balthazar lore that has ever existed in this franchise. So you are in a position to talk about him, to construct your own theories, to think about him. Check out the wiki to reinforce your opinions or, you know, corroborate some of your facts. But there you go. That's really what we know about the Menzies versus Balthazar war. That's a hell of a lot of the stuff there. And that's how it ends, with Balthazar really having the upper hand. But now, 250 years later, Balthazar has become a fallen god. Seems to have fallen out of favor with his brothers. Why? What has happened? How have they dimmed his light? Very, very curious stuff. And with all of that information there, maybe we could do some speculation in an upcoming video. Thanks very much for checking out the tour of the Fissure of Woe, guys. Hopefully you found some of this stuff interesting, learned a little something. If you did, I'm glad to have produced the video. These are always my favorite things, teaching people the cool stuff about the lore. And it was great to have a refresher for myself as well. So thanks, guys. Hope you have a great evening. Still tons more to talk about with Flashpoint, Zin, the Druids, and so forth. I'll see you in the comments if you guys want to offer any suggestions for that. And until next time, have a great evening, everyone. Catch you later.